Kyle Pitts is the biggest X factor for the Falcons' success in 2023, as their offense will go as far as they will carry him. And despite what you heard, oh yes, Kyle Pitts can carry them very far.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And, guys, we thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. Shout out to the everydayers that are here each and every day checking out the podcast. Follow in their footsteps, follow their blueprint to life success by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So we are continuing Locked On Desmond Ridder week, but we are talking mostly about the tight end position today, and we'll spend a lot of today's conversation talking about Kyle Pitts and why he's a big part of, this team's potential for success in 2023. I'm not worried about what Kyle Pitts is going to do this season. We'll talk about that a little bit later and on why, but essentially he was very quietly a top 5 tight end last year. But one of the things we want to start off the conversation is piggybacking on something Desmond Ridder said earlier this week when he went on Good Morning Football and talked about how, the additions of Bijan Robinson and others is going to lead to this team being a lot more explosive. That's their goal, is to be more explosive. And obviously Bijan Robinson is going to help this team be a lot more explosive on the ground. We talked about this quite a bit at the end of last season, where we talked about how, as good as Tyler Algier was, there are plays where it's like, Tyler Algier gets 20 yards, a player like Bijan Robinson can get 40 yards. When Tyler Algier gets 40 yards, a player like Bijan Robinson is going to get 60 yards or take it to the house or whatever it is. But, while explosive run plays are very nice, it would be nice to get a little bit more explosive pass plays. Now, it's not to sit here and say that, one is more advantageous than the other. All the data and research I've done over, the last decade when it comes to generating those explosive 20-plus yard plays, when it comes to outcomes, it doesn't really matter how you get the play. All of them, regardless of whether they're run passes or, special teams, defense, explosive play, explosive plays, field flipping plays is really what it's about. And defense, those are turnovers. Special teams, those are, big kickoff returns, big punt returns. Doesn't matter how you get them. If you can flip the field, regardless of how you do it, it's going to be dramatically increase the probability that you put points on the board on that given drive. But we know that, throwing the ball and generating explosive plays through the air is much more common in the NFL than it is on runs. Basically, over the last 3 years, for every 20-plus yard run play that has been generated by an NFL offense, there are 5.5 20-plus yard pass plays. So there's your ratio there. And the Falcons were already near the top of the league in terms of generating explosive run plays. They had 17 last year, which was tied for 7th. If you extrapolate it based off of the number of attempts, it was 11th in the NFL. And they were 30th in the NFL in terms of explosive 20-plus yard plays through the air with only 37. But when you extrapolate per attempt or per drop back, really, they become about league average, slightly above league average a year ago. So there's a lot more room for growth in the air is basically the point I'm getting at. But they didn't really add a whole lot of explosiveness at the wide receiver and tight end positions, right? Mac Hollins, Scotty Miller, Jonnu Smith combined for 14 explosive plays last year, but it's kind of a net loss because Olamide Zaccheaus, Damiere Byrd, Michael Pruitt, and Anthony Firkser combined for 15 explosive plays last year, not to mention the 4 explosive runs that Marcus Mariota had last year. So you do have a net loss of explosive plays just purely off of personnel, right? And the changes the Falcons have gone. And so therefore, I think for the Falcons, when it comes to being more explosive, in addition to adding Bijan Robinson and some of these other pieces, it's really more they're looking for internal growth than necessary external growth that are going to come in and completely revamp this offense. And, while I think they're hopeful that, players like Scotty Miller, who, was very explosive in 2020 with the Bucks, and Jonnu Smith was very explosive with the Titans in 2019, they can get back to those ways. Again, I think it's going to be internal growth from players like Drake London and Kyle Pitts. And Drake London had the team high 10 explosive plays last year. 6 of those came after Kyle Pitts' injury. 4 of those came in the final 4 games where Desmond Ridder was the starter. So it's tough to read a little bit. Do you assume that he's going to just pick up where he left off, or is the player that we saw in the first half of the season more likely to be? Obviously, for, obvious reasons, I'm hoping, that we'll see more second half Drake London and then first half Drake London. And so that will lead to him being, similar to what Roddy White was throughout his career, which is a guy that can get you 15 plus explosive plays each and every year. Probably not I think Julio averaged like 25 explosive plays a year. So he's not going to be Julio. I don't think so. I think there was only one receiver in the league last year. I think it was Justin Jefferson that hit 25 last year. But, I do think the biggest growth potential internally is from Kyle Pitts, right? In addition to Drake London, and Kyle Pitts only had 5 explosive plays last year after a rookie season where he had 16. And we know that that dip was mostly on the quarterback, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Kyle Pitts was the Falcons' main deep threat last year. And given, who the Falcons picked up this offseason, I expect Kyle Pitts to be their main deep threat again this year. About 25% of his targets were 20-plus yard throws. That was the 3rd highest percentage among tight ends in the league last year. So there is a lot of growth opportunity there. We saw Desmond Ridder's deep ball not be the greatest last year in his 4 starts. We're hopeful that he'll be more than that. We were hopeful that, that would be one of the areas that he would improve upon Marcus Mariota, who was at the bottom of the league in terms of completion percentage on 20-plus yard throws at 27%. Well, Desmond Ridder only completed 20%, right? And so that's going to be something that he's going to need to work on. That's something that he was good at times in his college career, some years not so good at. So that is going to be a legit question mark. That's probably the one question mark that I personally have about Desmond Ridder's game. Will he be an effective, be able to exploit all 3 levels of a defense, right? We know he can do the short stuff. We know he can do the intermediate stuff. Can he do the vertical deep stuff, right? And, I liken it a little bit to Matt Ryan, because I didn't think Matt Ryan was ever the greatest deep ball passer either, but you saw a clear uptick in his efficiency when it came to throwing the deep ball and his accuracy throwing the deep ball, when he had Julio Jones on his team, right? To me, like, you look at Matt Ryan's first 5 years in the NFL, and he had 1 year, I think 2008, where he was like an above average deep passer. And then you look at it starting in 2014, which was Julio Jones's first peak season, coming back from that 2013 year where he got hurt. And the next 6 years, and then basically over those next 6 years, Matt Ryan was like a top 10, top 15 deep passer every single year, with 2017, I think, being the exception there. And it's I don't think that's a coincidence that throwing to Julio Jones makes you a better deep ball thrower, right? And so it's about crafting an environment that's conducive to deep passing, and that's getting vertical stretch receivers in the building. And that, to me, is not something that the Falcons have really done outside of Kyle Pitts, outside of Scotty Miller. We'll see if they can do that. But if you do wind up doing that, and then the quarterback still can't hit the throws, then you clearly know, okay, it's not because this guy, isn't a good deep threat. It's because the quarterback is the problem, right? And so I don't know if the Falcons have built that. That's basically what I'm saying. So we're hoping that connection between Desmond Ridder and Kyle Pitts, blossoms in the same ways that we saw late in the season, that connection between Desmond Ridder and Drake London. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence that because of that, that connection, you saw a big uptick in the explosive plays that Drake London had, not in addition to the fact that there's no Kyle Pitts in the presence. And so someone had to stretch defenses, and it was all up to Drake London, and he was able to produce. So, that gives you hope, right? That's the reason it gives you hope, that gives you optimism. But of course, time will tell on that issue. But, talking about Kyle Pitts, I think there was a recent episode of Mina Kimes' podcast. They had Robert Mays on. They were talking about the players that matter for each NFC team. And I think one of them, I can't remember which one, talked about Kyle Pitts. And I think that Kyle Pitts Ridder connection is probably the most important unknown for this team that is going to determine their success this year, right? The stronger that rapport between Desmond Ridder and Kyle Pitts is, I think the better the season the Falcons wind up having, because it's threefold, right? It's the deep passing, it's the efficiency on third downs, it's the red zone efficiency as well. Those are three areas that Kyle Pitts can have the biggest impact for this football team. And that's really what this team's identity is built around, right? They're going to be, one of the best run teams. They want to be efficient on third downs. They want to be efficient in the red zone. And then they want to be able to dial up an explosive play every now and then on a semi-consistent basis. And if they check all four of those boxes, this offense is going to be really hard to stop for a lot of defense, because that's exactly what the 2020 Titans were under Arthur Smith. They were second in the league that year in rushing yards. They were fifth in third down efficiency. They were second in red zone efficiency. And they were 12th in total explosive plays, 14th in, explosive pass plays per attempt, and third in explosive run plays per attempt. And that was a team that wound up finishing fourth in the league in scoring that year. That was a team that was fourth in the league in offensive DVOA, according to Football Outsiders. And that's a legit top 5 offense if you can check all four of those boxes in the ways that the 2020 Titans did. Now, I don't expect the Falcons are going to be that type of unit this year, right? Right now, I don't think they're super far away from that, because they're like top 15 in most, if not all of those categories: the run game, the third down, the red zone, and the explosiveness. But, to me, it's a jump to go from 14 to 2, right? And especially given how young this team and relatively inexperienced they are at some key positions on the offense, I would not put those expectations on them this year. I think it's going to take a year or two for them to gel into that type of unit. But it goes back to something we talked about earlier on the podcast this week, was just like, this is phase 2 of their rebuilding process. And that type of unit that we're talking that's comparable to the 2020 Titans is kind of phase 3. Now, I know there's probably some of you out there that are saying, like, the 2020 Titans, who aspires to be the 2020 Titans? But if you're one of those people, then you're just wrong. Well, again, no one's going to sit here and tell you the 2020 Titans was the greatest offense ever, but that is a team that can be a very good team, right? That is an offense that scored more points than the number 2 offense in the league this past year, the Philadelphia Eagles. That is an offense that has outscored the Patrick Mahomes led Chiefs in 3 out of would have outscored 3 out of the 5 years that Patrick Mahomes has been the starting quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs. So anybody who's out here putting out there this notion that, like, the 2020 Titans are not something to aspire to, that type of top 5 caliber offense is not aspirational, is wrong, is basically the point. But, to round out our conversation about Kyle Pitts, the short version of the long story is that he has a significant potential impact to transform this team, right? That not only from the explosiveness potential that he brings to the offense. And again, if it's not clear, Kyle Pitts has the potential to be one of the most explosive and one of the most dynamic weapons in the NFL. Of course, you guys all know that, because that's why he was the 4th overall selection 2 years ago. But he also has the potential to check those efficiency boxes and be, one of the top, receivers in the league when it comes to third downs and red zone efficiency. And so if you're maxing out Kyle Pitts in those areas, then you're probably maxing out this offense, is basically the point I'm going to get to. But we'll continue talking more about Kyle Pitts and talk about, the notion of him having a disappointing 2022 is probably a little bit BS. There's some stats that show that if Mariota had hit him on a couple of these deep passes that we're talking about, like, no one would be sitting here calling Pitts' 2022 season a disappointment. That a handful of plays completely shifts the narrative for Kyle Pitts' 2022 season. And that is going to lead me, and hopefully you guys, to buy back all the Kyle Pitts stock that so many people were selling last year. But before we get into all of that, guys, head on over to FanDuel, make that fast break for the NBA playoffs. The Western Conference Finals are over. The Eastern Conference Finals aren't quite over. We'll see, if Boston can put up a fight to extend these things. And if they do, then head on over to FanDuel and make sure you use your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That means you get $1,000 back in bonus bets, even if your first bet doesn't win. And whether you want to bet on the Eastern Conference Finals, whether you want to bet starting next week on the actual finals, you want to bet on the upcoming NBA draft, or, you're not into basketball, you want to bet on Major League Baseball, football, any sport that you can think of, you can head on over to FanDuel, #1 sports book in America. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you'll get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So, there's a lot of talk last year about, Kyle Pitts regressed and all these things, but we all recognize, and like, I'm not one of these people that tends to blame all the Falcons' problems on Marcus Mariota, but I will blame this particular issue on Marcus Mariota. This is the one area where I will back up the truck and run over Marcus Mariota, throw him under the bus. His inability to hit the deep ball and that lack of rapport that he had with Kyle Pitts left a lot of yards on the field, right? And then you couple that with Pitts, getting hurt and missing 40% of the season, also, led to a lot of this narrative that Kyle Pitts was bad last year or he regressed last year. Now, when I went back and looked at all 14 of Mariota's deep throws to Kyle Pitts, and give or take a couple of yards, if you count all the air yards that the ball traveled, it's roughly about 400 yards that were left on the field on on 13 of Mariota's misses on those 20+ yard throws. Now, Mariota hit 1 out of those 14 throws, which is well below the league average. League average is about 40% hit rate on those deep passes. So let's say if he was average, he would have hit 6 out of those 14 passes. So he missed about 5 throws. And, you do the math on that. That's roughly about 150 of those 400 yards that were left on the field just from Mariota not being a league average quarterback when it came to connecting with Kyle Pitts. And if you were to tack on those 5 catches and 150 yards onto Kyle Pitts' totals through, 10 games, that would have been 33 catches for 506 yards. That's an average of 15.3 yards per reception, which is slightly more than the 15.1 yards per reception that he averaged in his quote unquote historic rookie season. And then if you extrapolate, the totals from those 10 games, or really 9.5 games, because he got hurt in the opening drive in the third quarter against the Bears, if you extrapolate it to a full 17 game season, you would have found Kyle Pitts having 106 targets, 59 catches, 905 yards, 15.3 yards per reception, and 3 touchdowns. Now, those numbers right there would have been 5th among tight ends in targets, 8th in receptions, 3rd in yards, and 19th in touchdowns. Now, obviously, the one stat that stands out that is different than the other ones is the touchdowns. And we know that the red zone stuff, we've been talking about it for 2 years now, that still needs to get sorted out with Kyle Pitts moving forward. But, and I'm sure some of you are like, coulda, shoulda, woulda, yeah, you can say that about Kyle Pitts. But the things, Kyle Pitts can't control whether his quarterback is overthrowing him on footballs when he's wide open on deep passes. And he can't really control if he gets hurt, right? I guess he has 2% control over that, but if he had complete control over that, he wouldn't have got hurt, right? So it's one of those things where I feel like the things that Kyle Pitts could control for, he did very well at. The things that he could not control for, quarterback play and injury luck, were the things that let him down. And the fact that Kyle Pitts was able to basically be on pace to put up top 5 numbers, top 10 numbers across the board at the tight end position on a team that runs the ball as much as the Falcons do, to me, is again a testament to Kyle Pitts. So, anybody who's pushing this narrative that, Kyle Pitts is a bad pick or the wrong pick or a wasted pick or he's overrated, that's just people pushing an agenda. It's still people that are butthurt about, the Falcons not taking their favorite player, 2 years ago, and they're just butthurt about it. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, Kyle Pitts was incredible in 2022. It's a disappointing year in a lot of ways. But again, most of the ways that is disappointing were not things that Kyle Pitts could control. And so basically what I'm sitting here saying is nobody should be selling their Kyle Pitts stock at this point in time, right? And I think a lot of it is due to the fact that Kyle Pitts, because he was the highest tight end drafted ever, right? And because he was filling in the shoes immediately left by, one of the biggest voids you could possibly leave in Julio Jones, the expectations for Kyle Pitts coming out of the gates were impossibly high. But when you actually look at the success and the production that he's had at age 21 and 22, basically the only tight end in NFL history that has been more productive in that span is Rob Gronkowski, who I personally think is the greatest tight end ever, right? And so it's when you look at Kyle Pitts is ahead of Tony Gonzalez, he's ahead of Jason Witten, and it's this thing where it's there's this impossible standard that he's set up for when it's just this guy is on pace to basically be a Hall of Famer, and yet people are basically he's a bad pick because Marcus Mariota overthrew him you know, a half dozen times too many, and you know, he got hurt on a low hit from Eddie Jackson or whatever, and then people are like, oh, he's bad, you know, and it's like he's expected to do things at 22 at a position that we know takes time for guys to hit in the league, that, you know, he's expected to do at 22 that other guys didn't do until they were like 25 or 27. And because he's not doing them at 22, when, you know, Travis Kelce didn't do it at 27 or George Kittle didn't do it at 25, and it's like, well, he's bad because he's not doing this thing. And it's like, you know, if you had held those guys to that same standard, you would have been out on those guys long before you were out on Kyle Pitts. So again, if you're selling Kyle Pitts stock, I will buy it all back. And in a couple of years, I will be laughing all the way to the bank in why I have, you know, I bought this Hall of Fame tight end for super cheap. So again, anybody out there that's pushing, you know, Kyle Pitts is bad or Kyle Pitts was stunk last year, that is a person pushing a narrative. They don't know football. That's what I will say. So we'll leave that aside and we'll talk about the other tight ends on the Falcons roster, because I think you should also be buying Parker Hesse and Jonnu Smith stock. You know, we're talking about this positionless football, and I think, you know, those two guys are integral to the style of football, as well as, you know, guys like Bijan Robinson when it comes to playing this positional football. And we'll get into that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But you know, for my everydayers that are out here listening every single day on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, tomorrow's episode probably will be a Q&A, and maybe we'll talk about some of the developments in OTAs. There isn't a whole lot to talk about in OTAs at this point in time, since, you know, they're glorified walkthroughs and 7-on-7s at this point. But we'll see if something emerges in the next 24 hours that is worthy of discussion, as well as it's an opportunity for you guys to send in your questions via Twitter, via Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, or you can hit me up in the Locked On Falcons Discord, a link in the description below. So, you know, one of the things I did, you know, in the lead up to this Locked On Desmond Ridder week was go back and watch, you know, the last 4 games of the season, and particularly chart like the first opening game scripts, the first 15-20 plays for all 4 of those games. And one thing kind of stood out to me was how often the Falcons were utilizing 13 personnel, especially against the Saints. Now, the next week against the Ravens, they used less of it. And then basically against the Bucs and the Cardinals, they didn't use any of it. And I think part of it was due to it not being that effective. And some of that is owed to, you know, Parker Hesse, Michael Pruitt, and Anthony Ferguson probably are not going to be, you know, the ideal standard as that 13 tight end, especially when you compare it to who the Falcons will potentially field in that grouping. And 13 personnel, by the way, guys, is 3 tight end sets. You know, and now you have Kyle Pitts, a healthy Kyle Pitts, a Jonnu Smith, and Parker Hesse as your main 3 tight ends when you go to that 13 personnel. And part of me wonders, going back to, you know, conversations we had at the end of last year, which is, you know, seeing Arthur Smith, you know, throw the ball more with Desmond Ridder and being a little bit more of a balanced offense. And a lot of us wondering, okay, is this the true version of the offense that Arthur Smith wants to run? And so because the Falcons came out of that bye week running a lot of, you know, 3 tight end looks, it makes me wonder if that's the true offense that the Falcons want to run. And it makes sense why, you know, Jonnu Smith was, you know, technically the first offseason addition that they announced, although, you know, there's some, you know, randomness to that, but it's all part of the positionless football stuff, right? And we saw how often the Falcons moved Parker Hesse around, and I'm sure some of you guys caught a couple of weeks ago when we did our depth chart breakdown, and I had listed Parker Hesse as like a roster cornerstone player. It was a joke, but it is, like, in a ways, like, it's not that crazy a joke, because like the way that they utilize Parker Hesse and his ability to line up at fullback and tight end is integral to, I think, the versatility and flexibility that Arthur Smith wants to have in the offense. And so even though if Parker Hesse from a production standpoint isn't a roster cornerstone, I do think he is kind of like a cornerstone when it comes to how the Falcons want to play, in the same ways that like Patrick DeMarco was when Kyle Shanahan was here. Even if Patrick DeMarco was only, you know, I remember people saying like, oh, he only plays like 30% of the snaps, he's not that important. You guys all know that. You know, that's blasphemous here on the Locked On Falcons podcast, but you get what I'm saying. Like, Parker Hesse is that type of player. And I think Jonnu Smith also has that potential to be that type of player. I think we'll see, you know, a dozen or more times where we'll see Jonnu Smith line up in the fullback. You probably won't see him lead blocking a ton in that role. they'll dabble with him in that role. But I think primarily you'll often see him lined up in the backfield, and those are going to be instances where he'll be a pass catcher, where he'll run a reel route, he'll leak over the middle or something like that. They'll run a screen to him or something like that. And earlier this week on Twitter, I compared Jonnu Smith to Kyle Juszczyk, the 49ers fullback. And the context of why I made that comparison was, I was talking on Twitter about like the Falcons need to upgrade at wide receiver, and JJ Arcega-Whiteside is not necessarily that upgrade. And some people were like, well, they got Jonnu Smith and he'll fill the shoes. And it's like, well, Jonnu's role in Tennessee was not as a guy that can move the chains on third downs and be that, go-to pass catcher, right? When it came to third downs in Tennessee, you look at the numbers, like he was like 5th or 6th in the hierarchy, not only after A.J. Brown and Corey Davis, but also after Adam Humphries and Anthony Firkser and Tajay Sharp when it came to like attempts and third downs, and especially when it came to conversions. Like his conversion rate on third down was like abysmally bad, right? And so like Jonnu Smith is not really like that type of guy that you're going to line up and go out there and beat guys, although he is a mismatch guy, right? But it isn't because like he's this refined route runner. And that was something that Tyler Rowland, the Locked On Titans host, said when he came on the podcast to talk about Jonnu Smith when we signed him back in March. Like, that's not really Jonnu Smith's game. That's a big reason why he failed in New England, because New England is like this precision timing-based offense, and like Jonnu Smith doesn't fit that. The comparison to Juszczyk is similar because Juszczyk is not a go-to option for the 49ers on third downs, right? Like they're not throwing the ball to Kyle Juszczyk. Usually something has gone wrong when Kyle Juszczyk is getting targets on third downs, because it usually means, George Kittle or, Christian McCaffrey or Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk aren't open. Like he's their 5th option on third downs, right? At most. But what Kyle Juszczyk does, similar to what Jonnu Smith is expected to do, is create those mismatches on early downs, right? This is why I sit here and I say things like, I don't think defensive play calling is as meaningful as people. It's coaching and play calling on defense is overrated because defenses tend to be predictable, right? And that's kind of the secret behind the Kyle Shanahan offense, which is he's going to present you run heavy formations, that 21 personnel, 2 running backs, with Kyle Juszczyk being that second running back at the fullback position, and that forces defenses to play base defense. So when defenses see 21 personnel, two tight end sets, or 12 personnel, 13 personnel, 3 tight end sets, their go-to is to play base defense because those are run formations. Teams generally run out of those formations. And Shanahan's secret, and this is similar to Arthur Smith's secret, is he's going to present that and then he's going to throw out of it. And he's going to get a mismatch because you're going to put, a linebacker, a slow, strong side linebacker. You're going to put, not Stephen Nicholas today, but like back in the day, certainly, you would put a Stephen Nicholas on a Kyle Juszczyk and he would just roast that guy. And it's a similar thing. You can create some mismatches there when you get him against, a slow linebacker or whatever the case may be. And, that was Arthur Smith's secret as well last year. There's a reason why the Falcons were top 3 in EPA, or expected points added, on first and second down during the 13 games that Marcus Mariota started, right? And that wasn't because Marcus Mariota was this super efficient and reliable passer on early downs. It was because their personnel dictated mismatches, and the Falcons did a good job in that run heavy personnel, whether that was 21, 12, 13, utilizing the play action and gashing teams on the intermediate levels, right? And, this is part of the ongoing, arms race between defenses and offenses in the league. And this is why teams are, because of the ways that the Falcons and 49ers attack teams, you're seeing more teams go to these split safety looks, which is taking that extra safety, taking him out of the box that typically, in the back for most of the decade would play in the box when teams would play cover 3 on early downs, and they're moving him back so that he can better defend against those intermediate crossing routes that you like to run on play action passes. And so the Falcons, the way that they're zigging, and a lot of other teams in the league are zigging, is okay, you're going to take that safety out of the box to defend the run. Well, we're just going to run the ball down your throat. But that's a whole conversation for a separate day. But the point is that having these 3 tight ends that you can now transition and move this guy in the backfield, move this guy around the formation, and suddenly you're in 13 personnel, but you present as 22 personnel, which is 2 two running backs, or a running back, a fullback, and two tight ends, by moving Parker Hesse into the backfield or something as a lead blocker, or moving Jonnu Smith into the backfield and create mismatches against a slow-footed linebacker or whatever. Those are things that are going to be things that Arthur Smith is going to really utilize. And I think this is going to be a well-used tool in Arthur Smith's toolbox. So that is something I'm looking forward to. I'm also excited to see what the other tight ends can do, particularly with John Fitzpatrick. Now that he's going to be healthy this year. Last year was kind of a redshirt year for him, coming off that injury, that toe or foot injury that he had that basically prevented him from really doing anything in the preseason and training camp. So I'm eager to see what he does, because he can be, kind of I won't say a poor man's Parker Hesse, because I guess poor man's Parker Hesse, because I don't think he's going to be as good as Parker Hesse right now, but I think he can develop into a second version of that. And because he probably brings a little bit more athleticism and size and all these things, that maybe he has a little bit more potency as a pass catcher if that can be developed. I'm also, that crazy person that's also looking to see what Felipe Franks can do in his second full season as a tight end, making this transition. And I know there's a lot of Falcon fans that are like, I still don't understand why Felipe Franks still has a job, because you don't understand the Falcons' mission, because basically what they're trying to do, and it's certainly debatable whether or not they will succeed in doing this, but they're trying to basically make Felipe Franks into like a 6'6" version of Jonnu Smith. And that's going to create even more mismatches and allow them to play that style of football. So he's kind of their long-term project in that role, a player that they can either stash on the practice squad and the back end of the roster and hopefully develop into that player. That's the vision for Felipe Franks. We'll see if he gets there. Who knows? If he does get there, it's probably not going to be necessarily this year, but you're hoping to see, gains in that regard. So we'll see what those guys can do, but I think the tight end position is going to be a big part of this offense. And, if we can get Pitts putting his best foot forward, Jonnu Smith getting back to what he was in Tennessee in the Arthur Smith offense, and Parker Hesse just doing Parker Hesse things, this tight end group is going to be a big part of how this Falcons offense presents itself, in addition to the running backs. We made a lot of hype over the last couple of weeks being locked on Bijan, talking about how great this running back room is with Algier and Patterson and Bijan and the versatility that those guys have. But I think the tight end group is also an underrated aspect of this positionless football, and the versatility and the flexibility, and being an integral part of this 2023 Falcons offense. So a lot of things to be excited about at this tight end position, a lot of ways that how this tight end room goes is going to reflect, I think, how this team is going to go, especially that connection between Pitts and Ridder. And if those two guys are, putting their best feet forward, whatever that statement is, pluralize, you're going to see a lot of great things, I think, from this Falcons offense. And certainly I think Jonnu Smith and Parker Hesse will sort of slot in where they can slot in and be sort of complementary pieces to that sort of big picture. But we know that, Pitts and London and Bijan and Algier, these guys are going to be like the core foundation of this offense, but all these other pieces are going to be very nice complementary pieces around that core. So we'll just sort of have to see how that goes, guys. But tomorrow we'll be back for more OTA talk, and we'll see, maybe I'll wind up doing a full summary on sort of what my general thoughts and expectations are for Desmond Ridder. I think there'll be highs and lows, but we'll save that potentially for tomorrow. Also an opportunity for you guys to ask questions, whether they're Desmond Ridder related or other questions related or unrelated to the Atlanta Falcons. Of course, all the places that you can hit me up are, just search for Locked On Falcons on your favorite platform, Facebook, Twitter, the Discord link in the description below, YouTube comments, of course. And of course, you can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. So guys, really appreciate you tuning in for another listen here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. Go check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. They're doing their summer scouting. So if you're invested in, who those next stars that will be plugged and played on the Falcons offense or defense, of course, Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez of the Locked On NFL Draft podcast have you covered. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.